Hi, everyone. So, whether we are using this as part of a setup for a 20th and 21st century global issues project, or we're just using this information to kind of give us an idea of what's happening since World War II and global issues that have developed in the modern era. Basically, I'm just going to give us some insight into what's been happening. These aren't all the global issues, it's not all the facts. Some of this is even slightly changed, and I will kind of point that out as we go. But yeah, I'm going to go ahead and just kind of walk you through and explain some of these problems. So hopefully this will load and will work out. So since World War II, the world has been really, really connected, and there's been a lot going on here. Okay. So what we have seen are there some economic differences that have impacted the world. I'm just going to shrink my screen, my video here, so you can see this more. So what we see is we used to talk about first world and second world nations, and it's kind of an insult. So now we kind of talk more about developed and developing nations. And so what we see is there's like this global north of industrialized nations of Europe and North America. There tends to be a higher standard of living. Whereas in the global south, we see these are like developing nations. There's poorer nations of Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, with the exceptions of India and China. It's been difficult for these nations to keep up. They have been struggling. And some of this is stemming from the age of imperialism and some of these lasting impacts that we have left over from that era. So as you can see in this map, the northern hemisphere is either like a royal blue or cardinal blue. These are those so-called developed nations. They tend to have a higher standard of living and larger gross domestic product or production per capita by the government. Whereas in the global south, you tend to see it's like yellow and oranges and browns. They tend to have a lower standard. You do have obviously the exceptions, such as like Australia, which was a colony of Great Britain, and then some other parts of like South Africa, also former colony of Great Britain, and then you have the southernmost part of South America as well. What we've also seen develop globally are epidemics and pandemics. So, as of April 2020, we are currently living in a global pandemic due to COVID-19. And so, for many of you, you are experiencing this. But one of the first epidemics that I personally had lived through was the AIDS epidemic. And this is obviously very different than, say, COVID-19 because of the way that AIDS spreads. But what we've seen is that it does spread globally, and various countries have different rates. Let me see if I can get this. I might have to close this out. I don't know why this is. But so let me see if I can. I'm just going to X that out for now. So AIDS is a potentially deadly disease. Since the outbreaks in the 1980s, we have seen scientists develop medication, and now it's no longer a death sentence. Many people can live for years with HIV and AIDS and have a fairly normal life, but the medication can be very expensive. Without treatment, it is deadly, but it is preventable with proper information, and it can be treatable, but again, expensive. It has been considered a pandemic due to the worldwide impact. There were about 40 million cases worldwide, about 20 million in Africa, and these numbers ebb and flow. We have seen that with information in education, we can prevent this from spreading further or increasing in numbers. What we see is a large parts of global south, especially Africa, have been hit the hardest. And part of this is access to education and the ability to treat it. Of course, education and economics really impacts a nation's ability to combat the disease. And this is true for many other epidemics and pandemics that have played out throughout our history. Okay. We've also seen a lot of increase in trade. This is a globalized economy, meaning that we are connected. So, what we have seen with this COVID-19 pandemic, excuse me, my chair is squeaky. That supply lines have been interrupted, and this has led to scarcity of many goods that come from other nations that the U.S. does not produce, and oil is a similar commodity. So you see that it travels from various areas all over the world. There's various prices that could be impacted, and let me see. I think this map might be, kind of blocking some information as well. But hopefully that image helps you recognize that there is this interconnectedness through alliances, trade, immigration. We are all connected. There are global corporations, also known as multinational corporations. We can't survive without goods from other nations. And many people are realizing that living through this COVID-19 pandemic, where we can't get bleach wipes or Lysol, things that are being made in other nations. Even medical masks and medical supplies, ventilators that are needed are made outside the United States, and it makes it difficult for us to get those goods. So we used to need resources, technology, a stable government, capital, that's money, and an increase in consumer demand in order to industrialize, which is what we saw take place in like Great Britain. But also what we see taking place today is you also need a broad educational system that meets the needs of the masses. You need computers because in the 21st century, everything's done digitally. As many of you know, you've been messaging me through Google Classroom, and I can respond on my phone. I can respond through email on my computer. We can Zoom. We can do Google Meetups. Like there's so many ways that we're connected now, and computers are very vital for that. And for a nation to industrialize today or be part of this global economy, much of that technology is going to be needed, as well as roads, electricity, railroads, and airports in order to get those goods. We've also seen since the 1950s into current era, a green revolution. So this is a new, not new, but in the past several decades, we're using artificial fertilizers. We're using large agricultural machines. We're modifying crops using genetically modified organisms to produce more food. This has allowed us to create surpluses in areas that had previously struggled to meet the needs of their growing populations. And we've seen in India and China, they have booming populations. But it tends to be kind of expensive to get food and shelter there. And this also leads to pollution in these regions. Is my understanding that India is the largest democracy in the world, and China itself has over 1 billion people. Just to have an idea, the United States at this point has about 326 million people living in our borders. So some of the other revolutions besides the Green Revolution with new agricultural things that are taking place, genetic revolution. So I've mentioned genetic modification for organisms, but even genetic research for human beings and animals, and mapping the human genome, etc. And then of course the computer revolution. So in like 1995, when the World Wide Web went live, I was a teenager. Computers were still pretty big and bulky. I was in college before I had a cell phone, before I had my own computer. I was in graduate school before I had a laptop. And now I basically can walk around with this little thing. I can check my bank statements. I can pay my bills. I can check my credit score. I can call my parents. I can video chat with my grandma. I can video chat with you. I can post lessons for you. I can access your lessons. I can post your grades. Everything with this tiny little phone. That is a computer revolution. It's also sometimes called the information revolution, because at any point, if I want to know something and either my data is working or my Wi-Fi is working, I can look up anything I want to know and within seconds have it in my palms of my hand. So this has completely revolutionized the way we live just within my own lifetime. When I was in high school, I didn't have this. I used encyclopedias. If I was lucky, I could go to the school library and the dial up was quick enough that I could go and look things up there. But mostly I stuck with books and encyclopedias. Even as an undergraduate student, I went to the library, I checked out books, and I took notes on paper. We don't really do that anymore. All of that is the computer revolution. But with all this new technology and advancements, we've also seen a lot of environmental issues in our lifetimes. So, biodiversity, what we see is that human beings have had a significant impact on their land. And part of that is we're clearing land to farm. This leads to increased production. Many types of plants and animals have now been endangered or face extinction or even have become extinct because of human activity. And what we see is this impacts biodiversity. This essentially could harm us when certain plants and animals that have a benefit are gone. And so that's something we have to be mindful of as we develop and expand as a civilization. Because once these animals or plants are gone, they're gone. We cannot bring them back. Contrary to what we might think based off of Jurassic Park, we can't bring them back. But what we have seen is a number of organizations, such as the International Whaling Commission, the World Wildlife Federation, Greenpeace. These are all organizations that are acting to limit the killing of animals and preserve the natural habitats as well as plants. But even individuals, like I try to stay away from single-use plastic. So I have a metal water bottle that I refill from home. It also saves me money. I try to reduce the waste in our house. We compost, we try not to drive around wasting fuel and creating more carbon in the atmosphere if we don't have to, So like as an individual, you can also make choices that can impact. And then this helps lead into global warming. So you've probably heard it called global warming. You probably, heard of global climate change. Some people use these terms interchangeably. They're a little different. And in our web quest, you'll be exploring this a little bit more. But what we see is that carbon dioxide builds up in the atmosphere, which traps the heat from the sun, and this rises temperatures worldwide. It doesn't feel like that this week because it's the middle of April and I had snow. It's still kind of cold and rainy, and my heat's still on. But that's why we now refer to this more as global climate change, because climates around the world have been changing. We're seeing more extreme weather like tornadoes and hurricanes, earthquakes. We've had a couple of earthquakes recently in upstate New York, but also we do see that we tend to hit record temperatures every year as well. And as more nations industrialize and they're creating more pollutants, this can lead to more of this carbon dioxide buildup in the atmosphere, which can lead to the ice caps melting, which can lead to coastal areas losing coastal land or also flooding. This also threatens people and endangers animals throughout the world. There's in Indonesia and throughout the Pacific, there are some whole islands with inhabitants at risk of complete flooding and being completely swallowed by the sea as our polar ice caps melt. So this is something we should, keep in mind as we work through this unit. And this PowerPoint is posted if you want to look further at this diagram. So some of the things that have been done, you've probably heard about various meetings that have taken place recently by world leaders. But what we see is in 2012, the Kyoto protocols were implemented by the United Nations, short UN, essentially having those nations who agreed to this try to reduce their emissions by 2012. So they're producing less than they did in 1990. We also see efforts to control fossil fuels. You have alternative fuels such as hybrid or electric cars. We've seen other nations try to use nuclear power, solar, wind, hydroelectricity, etc., to try to impact and reduce the amount of fossil fuels used, which increase carbon in the atmosphere. We've also seen carbon taxes or carbon credit systems for businesses. So carbon tax, there's a tax on how much carbon you are producing as a business. But you also see credit systems where you basically can buy credits from companies who've reduced their emissions if you're unable to reduce yours and you're using all your credits up. So it kind of balances out. I've also done some shopping online since I can't go to the mall, and there's a number of companies now that are carbon neutral. And essentially, what they do is to offset the impact of shipping and production, they are planting trees and doing other activities to help reduce carbon in the atmosphere to try to offset what they're producing or causing due to shipping costs. So it's interesting. Desertification is often kind of misconstrued as like a desert is expanding, but it's not just a desert expanding. But we see is loss of arable land. So we're losing land that we could otherwise farm, and it's happening all over the world. So any place that's red on this map, it's a very high vulnerability. Any place that's gray is dry areas. And of course, where it's blue, it's cold. So deserts aren't always sandy areas. It's basically wherever you're getting low amounts of like rain and other precipitation. And so we see that there's many areas around this world that are impacted by desertification. And I gotta go back and fix these maps. I don't know why they keep blocking all my information. So what we've seen is over the last several decades, human activity has increased land becoming barren. These are dry areas. There's very little protection. Herds of animals and human water consumption has made it harder to farm, and it has caused an increase in the spread of these issues, leading to what they call desertification. And essentially, if nothing's done, we're going to have more and more barren land, which can impact farms, herd animals, and make it more difficult to produce more food. So, one of the areas that often comes up with this is in Africa along the deserts, and they joke it's hot as Sahel. The Sahel region is expanding and becoming hotter and drier. And then it makes it very difficult to farm in those areas. Places like China, though, have implemented to prevent like the Gobi Desert expanding, what they call like a green wall, where they've planted greens, and they are using irrigation to try to limit the spread and impact of the Gobi Desert as it expands through this process of desertification. And China's not the only one looking into this as well. Other nations have investigated different crops, even using genetically modified organisms that can grow in dry conditions. They use sand walls to try to stop creeping drifts of sand that tends to then develop as desertification process takes hold. Another problem that we're seeing is overpopulation, and different scientists have different ideas about this. We are talking about like 7 billion people in the world today. And as our world population grows, we need more resources, we need more homes, we need more employment opportunities, educational opportunities, all these things. And if we're unable to meet those needs, this could lead to mass starvation and poverty. And some of the other problems that stems from this is that as we grow and expand our population and they need more places to live, we tend to spread out. And then what we do is we clear forests for farmland to feed them. We even will expand cities, this process of urbanization, or spread out, which can impact sensitive environmental areas to make room for people. We also see that some nations who are competing with each other for resources have led to conflict and even war, as they're struggling to gain access to various resources for their people. So there hasn't really been much done officially to combat overpopulation. Some nations have tried to use like sex education policies and access to birth control, but one of the policies that come up probably the most is China's one-child policy. China was really struggling under Mao Zedong to address their rapidly growing population, and there's a lot of poverty and starvation at the time. So adults in cities were allowed to have only one child. If they broke this, There are severe penalties. At different points in China's history, some of these penalties were very severe, but they have been able to decrease their population growth to a manageable birth rate. Although in the recent years, they have loosened up on this policy some, and urban areas have seen the ability for people to have more than one child, provided they are providing for their medical and education, etc. It had typically out in rural areas not really been enforced because there's more space and more land. And then, of course, they tend to be more agricultural than these cities where there's a lot of overpopulation. So various scientists have been studying rural population growth, and as you can see, there's been significant increases over the last few centuries. And some people are concerned that by 2050, we'll be approaching 9 billion people, and it'd be very difficult. Today, people have made personal decisions not to have more than one child or not to have any children. And what we've seen is new estimates coming out. We've also seen a number of nations having issues with their death rate being greater than their birth rate, meaning that more people are dying every day than children are being born. And so they're not producing enough children to replace those people who are passing away. And so they have a decline in population. You've probably heard about that in the United States. I know Italy has seen that. They also have one of the oldest populations, which is part of the reason why Italy went into a lockdown with the outbreak of COVID-19, because they had so many people living in Italy that were very susceptible and at risk to COVID-19. And of course, with our population, there's a problem with waste management. We produce a lot of trash, garbage, waste chemicals, toxic substances, which can all pollute food and water and other inhabitants for humans and animals. We need more and more space to create these landfills and deal with the waste. We could be poisoned by this. It's happened before where toxic chemicals were not disposed of properly, and then this has led to people getting very sick, even cancer. And so as our population grows, this will become more and more of a problem if we're not able to reduce our waste or figure out a more manageable way to deal with this. So, toxic sludge. So we do have recycling programs. People have moved to biodegradable materials to help reduce additions of landfills, but also the big one, and you've probably seen Jason Momoa. He's a big advocate for moving away from single-use plastics. Trying to stay away from paper and plastic goods or styrofoam or like water bottles that you just buy at the store and you use them once, you throw them away. Trying to reduce that. These are little things that everyone can do. Okay, so that's just kind of a taste at some of the things that we're going to be looking at in this web quest. And then also as we move through this unit, you're going to dive deeper into some of these and some additional ones, okay? So hopefully this just kind of gives you an idea of what's happening.